The cart squealed before the custodian could move. He stepped from the doorway, palm to the stone lintel, and saw two figures hauling a battered memorial plaque and a child swing toward a waiting cart. Suspicion tightened his jaw. He had walked this alley every evening for 20 years, and he knew which things belonged to the city and which were meant to be taken. He called out, voice low and deliberate, "Stop that cart!" The nearer man froze, the swing tilting. The custodian kept his hand on the lintel, feeling the grit and the faint damp of mortar under his fingertips. He did not wait for explanation. His suspicion had started as a small, not unpaid taxes, a rumor of sales, but it moved him forward now. He stepped into the lamp pool and shielded the brass of his lantern with both hands, a motion that showed care rather than threat. "Marlowe," he said. Addressing the taller figure by name, "You do not take the memorial." Marlowe hesitated. The younger man by the cart glanced at the custodian, and then down at the plaque's battered lettering. Marlowe raised two fingers and answered quickly, "We have a buyer. We have to clear the square." His words were flat and practical. The young scavenger, no more than a boy by his posture, murmured, "There's coin, sir." Marta, bent and wrapped in a shawl at the edge of the doorway, had been watching from shadows. She stepped forward holding a wrapped bundle that shifted with a sound of brittle paper. The dispute laid out the central problem in crude terms. Salvage versus shelter. The custodian put his lantern on the step and set one foot forward. He did not shout. He traced the plaque's edge with his eyes, then looked at Marlowe. "You will not sell what names are still worn into the stone." Suspicion moved to resolve. Marta's hand tightened around her bundle. The young scavenger's eyes darted between men. They argued aloud in low sentences that cut the chill. "You are sentimental." Marlowe, "Sentiment pays no rent. Names are not tile to sell." Marta answered. Marta, the custodian. "You should not be here alone with that paper." Marta put her bundle against her chest. It is the child's drawing. I kept it." The young scavenger swallowed and looked at the cart wheel that had a shim of the city's registry nails still clinging. When the conversation slowed, the custodian reached for his satchel and drew out a thin ledger. He set it where the lamplight pooled and opened it to a page of inked names and small marks. His hand hovered, then he turned the page with care. The ledger smelled of coal smoke and old glue. He read a name aloud, slow and steady, to remind them what was at stake. "Elias Barr, widow noted, left a swing." The young scavenger flinched. Marlowe shifted his weight. "You keep a list and call it law." He said. "You call it order, I call it witness," the custodian replied. He tapped the ledger with a finger, not as ownership, but as a record of choices already made. Doubt arrived then, a new pulse under his earlier suspicion. He had believed the city's choice to let parts of itself go was a communal pact. Seeing the swing, the plaque, and the boy's purse made him wonder whether that pact had been bought in secret. The young scavenger's mouth opened. He did not look at the custodian. "Marlowe paid me. He take what sells and leave the rest." His words landed like a small stone. Marta set her bundle down and crossed to the ledger. She reached and found a recent name struck out with a hurried hand. Her fingers trembled as she followed the line. A new event arrived every few minutes, and each one altered the argument. Marta shoved the struck out page toward Marlowe. "Who did this?" she demanded. Marta, calm. Marlowe began. Marta cut him off. "No. Tell me now." Her voice had the hard, precise edge of someone who had spent herself keeping the household accounts. "This is my brother's name." The struck line gave debate a new face. This was not only commerce, but erasure of people. Doubt shifted to anger in the custodian's chest. He stood straighter, the stoop less pronounced for a moment. He put both hands on the ledger and closed it slowly. "You will not sell names," he said again. The young scavenger looked down and admitted, "I did not know whose name it was." Marlowe to trust him. The exchange moved the moral axis of the scene. Marlowe's jaw tightened. We agreed to clear the east side. The council made room for the new road." His words were measured, but the custodian felt the change. This policy had been turned into profit. The custodian did not leave the ledger open. He kept it pressed to his side like a thin shield. "Then show me the council order." Marlowe spat a short answer. "There is no paper here." "Paper burns and changes hands." The custodian's eyes narrowed. He traced a seam in the doorway with one gloved finger, feeling the mortar fall away in tiny grit, the concrete detail that reminded him of the city's physical steadiness. Suspicion turned into a need to confirm. The young scavenger shifted again, now with guilt pushing at his shoulders. He blurted, "Marlowe paid coin." The city will not notice the small things. Marta's knuckles whitened on the ledger's cover. Not notice. She said, "Those were my neighbor's things." Marlowe stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Marta, we are practical. The city cannot rebuild everything. Some things have to go." The custodian answered with a steady rhythm of short sentences. "Choices matter. Names mark people. I will not let you erase them for coin." The standoff tightened. The custodian could feel the ledger in his satchel through cloth. He decided to insist on small acts of care that would slow the removal. For receipts, for lists, for signatures. Marlowe refused each request in turn, and the pace of the disagreement sped. Marta found a scrap of paper in her bundle. A child's inked hand, curled letters faded. She held it up and said, "Ilias's daughter drew this when she could not sleep. You will not take this." Her voice broke at the last word, and the boy looked away. Outside, the alley breathed a thin exhale of cold, and someone else came up the lane. The arrival was a soft footfall, a new figure on the edge of the square. It changed the scene again. The custodian looked over his shoulder, and then closed the ledger with a deliberate snap. The newcomer was a thin woman, wrapped in a coat that had seen many winters. She walked with the careful pace of someone who measured every step. Marta recognized her and called, "Sister." The woman answered only in a look and then handed a small, sealed envelope to Marta. The envelope contained a short note and a rusted brass token. Marta opened it and read aloud, each phrase clipped. "Do not let them take the child's name." We agreed on the bridge. Her hands did not tremble now. They steadied. A twist arrived. The bridge where official agreements had once been sealed had a recorded promise, and someone had kept proof. The custodian felt a change in his chest. Suspicion moved to focus, then to an urge to protect the ledger's integrity beyond the doorway. They left the doorway in a loose procession toward the square. The cart rumbled slowly. The young scavenger walked a step behind Marlowe, glancing at the ledger and the token in Marta's hand. The custodian pocketed his watch and kept one hand on the satchel strap. The walk tightened their choices. He chose the bridge because that was where formalities had been made. He thought a public place might force Marlowe into clarity. On the walk across the square, the custodian little. He observed small, concrete things and let them guide him. A roof slat missing on a house, a shutter hanging by one hinge, a fountain with moss in its basin. Each detail reminded him that the city's decay was physical and that every removed item changed how people moved through space. Marta kept the child's drawing in her lap. The young scavenger kept his eyes down, watching his boots. Marlowe kept his shoulders squared. They reached the old bridge as dawn pushed grey through the fog. The bridge had been the heart of an earlier decision, one recorded in documents and memory. The custodian felt the emotion in his hands now. Protective, precise, impatient at the idea of commerce naming who counted. He set the ledger on a flat stone and opened it in the lamplight, still clinging to the lanterns. Here Marlowe crossed his arms. "There is no law that prevents sale," he said. Confrontation rose. The custodian replied, "This ledger is what the people agreed to. You cannot erase it on your ledger and call it progress." Their words were short. The young scavenger shifted, but did not speak. Marta reached into her bundle and brought out the child's swing rope with careful fingers. She held it against the ledger. "The swing belongs to a name here," she said. "You will not carry it away and sell it for coin." The young scavenger began to cry softly. Marlowe pushed back. "You keep a book and call it sacred. The city must be practical. We must clear for the new road and the market." The custodian's response was an action. He put his palm over the ledger and turned his body to shield it. Marlowe tried to take the ledger's corner. The custodian tightened his hand. A small physical struggle began as Marlowe reached, and the custodian swept his arm across the page to protect the names. "Give it here," Marlowe demanded. "No," the custodian. The young scavenger whimpered, then spoke. "Stop it. Stop it now." The conversation became sharp and fast. "Marlowe, you promised the council would handle this." "Marta, Marlowe, enough." The custodian. The exchange moved to quick, clipped lines until their voices matched the motion of hands. In the struggle, the ledger slid. For a moment a name was almost exposed, and then the ledger dropped. slipping down toward the bridge's worn edge. Marta lunged, and Marta's shawl snagged on a nail. Her foot caught a rough stone and she nearly fell. The ledger hung at the edge, half in the custodian's glove, half outside his reach. The young scavenger cried out, "Marta!" That sudden cry was a mid-chapter cliffhanger. The ledger could fall. The city's choice might be decided by an accidental motion. No one expected how quick Marta became. She shoved past Marlowe, reached under the ledger, and with a practiced hand slid it back to safety. Her motion was decisive and without flourish. She breathed then and said, "I will hide it, not on the street. Not while you walk away with coin." The custodian felt a new shift. Anger at the attempted theft turned to guarded relief that someone else took a decisive step. Marlowe smiled a thin, controlled smile. "You hide it, and what then? You keep a private list and pretend it is public." The custodian did not answer with words. He watched Marta move toward the church vestry at the bridge's far end. She kept her steps low and even, like someone used to moving where others would not look closely. The young scavenger followed her, not speaking. Marlowe stepped back a measure. They moved into the vestry. Marta set the ledger into a dark niche beneath a worn statue. She pushed it deep and tamped stone dust into the cracks. Her hands moved methodically. The custodian stood in the doorway and traced a seam on the wooden jamb with a fingertip. He watched Marlowe hesitate, then turn and walk away toward the market with a slow gait that said the man would return with accounts to settle. The young scavenger paused at the threshold. He looked at the custodian and said, "I'm sorry." The custodian answered by placing the lantern near the niche and lighting the wick of a small candle. After the hidden act, the group's alignment changed. Marta did not announce what she had done. She instead, "We keep it between us. We will mark whose names are safe. We will not let coin decide." The custodian felt the shift from public procedure to private guardianship. Names will stay here while I can watch them." Marlowe's figure receded in the street. He called over his shoulder, "You cannot stop the road." The custodian's hands tightened on the satchel strap. The aftermath was not a return to calm. The custodian resumed his slow patrol as if the night's work required repetition. He walked the old routes, fingertips running over mortar lines and window thresholds. He lit and shaded his lantern with the same practiced motion, not for ceremony but for visibility where needed. He checked door hinges, listened for displaced pigeons in eaves, and kept his eyes on the registry of the city in the ledger that now lay under church stone. In the morning mist, the custodian sat on a step and opened the satchel. He drew the ledger out to count the pages with a slow, steady motion that read like care. He found a page where a name had been added in a different hand and a date scrawled roughly next to it. His suspicion returned, but less raw. Now it had become vigilance and study. He circled the date with a pencil and wrote a note in the margin. It was a small administrative act, but one that felt urgent. He folded the note and slipped it into the ledger. The custodian did not promise to stop all removal. He had no illusions about the city's shrinking. He only promised to mark what was to remain visible, to press small safeguards into otherwise inevitable loss. He walked back toward the bridge as people began to open shutters and sweep thresholds. The young scavenger passed him with a lowered gaze and murmured, "I will not take another name." Marta stood in the vestry doorway and watched him go. Marlowe's cart was already a narrow silhouette at the far end of the street. The chapter ends with a quiet, concrete act rather than a declaration. The custodian slid the ledger into a hollow under the church niche, tamped dust, and set the small candle so its flame would not gutter but would allow a trace of light to reach the paper. He ran a finger along the ledger's spine, noting the indentation where a name had been struck. Then he closed the niche and crossed the bridge, making a small note in his pocket watch of the hour. The ledger's ink was safe for now. The custodian lifted his lantern, shaded it, and resumed his watch along the streets he had chosen to protect. A clerk pressed a brass pin through the official paper on the market board, and the custodian shoved past the crowd, voice taut as wire. "What are you doing?" he demanded, palm flat on the pinched wood. Suspicion tightened his jaw. He had seen sudden orders before, but not set down like a verdict for the dead. The notice read the decision plainly. The district would not be repaired. It would be closed to reconstruction and left to time. The custodian's suspicion moved him forward. He needed to know whether this was cows or a plan. He stepped into the square while council attendants muttered. He had the ledger at his hip, a slow watch in his pocket, and the oil lantern in his satchel warming his fingers. People backed into doorways as he passed. A young remover froze with hands on a cart handle. The morning wind tugged at loose posters and dust rolled through puddles. The custodian kept his hands visible. He was 65, lean and slightly stooped, with a threadbare wool scarf and a brass key on its leather thong. He spoke in the slow cadence people had learned over years of his rounds. "Councilwoman," he said, naming her because naming organized the threat. "You cannot close this place without telling those who live here." He placed the name on the air like a ballast. The woman with the seal, Councilwoman Varco, looked at him without surprise. She wore a trimmed coat the color of old smoke and a ribbon that marked rank. The crowd fell to a hush at the name. Suspicion had started him. The next feeling was anger, sudden and controlled, because the square held things that mattered. "Miss Hale," Varco answered, calm and even. "The council has voted. The district is scheduled for managed dissolution. Orders stand." Her voice was short. Her hands did not tremble. Around her, 2 removers waited beside a cart stacked with personal items. A battered memorial plaque, a child's swing with frayed ropes, a folding chair with a missing slat. The objects were concrete. Their removal was an action that cut the square like a blade. The custodian moved a step closer, lantern thumbed against the satchel strap. "Who voted?" he asked. His mouth was a thin line. He kept his fingers from brushing the wood lintel of a shuttered shop, a habitual test of seams. That small habit had calmed him through 2 decades of nightly checks. The presence of the plaque in the remover's cart pulled at him. He remembered the night its brass plate had been pried loose. The swing's rope whining as it left the yard months ago. Those recollected movements were facts, not moods. Varco extended a sealed envelope. A clerk took the brass pin from the board and packed it into his palm. "Archivist Rahl has the records," she said. "We've posted notice and given time. This area is unsafe for rebuilding. It is better left as a memorial field." She used the word memorial as if it explained everything. The custodian's jaw tightened again. Suspicion shifted into indignation. He stepped toward the cart and squared himself between the 2 removers and the piled belongings. "You are taking names then," he said. "You are taking the swing." His voice held a short, clipped edge. The younger remover, lean and hair still dark from youth, hesitated with his gloved hands on the rope. The younger keeper, Thomas K., had his face turned away at first, as if he expected the custodian to back down. "We follow orders," a remover said. Councilwoman Varco signed this. The exchange snapped back and forth. The custodian used the family of people's names to anchor the argument. "Varco," he said. "Councilwoman Varco, you signed." He the name as accusation and questioned Varco. She answered once, then looked past him at the gathered faces. "We have a covenant." The ledger will explain. Her fingers did not move to comfort the removers. The custodian felt a new shift. Indignation thinned into a tired worry. He could taste metal on his tongue, the old sensation when some necessary violence was about to be called law. A voice called from the edge of the square. An old woman in a wool shawl pushed forward, clutching the wooden swing by its ropes. The swing seat had a child's initials carved into the underside. The woman moved with the careful gait of someone who keeps memory in her hands. "Please," she said, voice small but clear. "That is my Samuel's swing." She pressed the rope to her chest. Her knuckles were white around frayed fibers. The custodian took in the detail. The initials gouged shallow, the fresh mud on the ropes where it had been stored, the way her fingers worried the knot. This was not a symbolic mourning. It was someone holding a thing that meant a daily action once. Madame Varco replied, steady. "Orders say the district will not take new work. The council decided to allow the place to go quiet so we can focus resources elsewhere." Her sentence was bureaucratic and precise. The younger keeper swallowed. He had a name and lines of duty. The decision left him split. The custodian stepped closer to the widow and laid a gloved hand across the swing's rope without touching her fingers. He felt the rope's roughness under his glove and watched the younger keeper's eyes. "Thomas," he said softly, "remember the night the cart left." The name landed like a small command. Thomas looked at the custodian and then at the removers. He had the marks of someone who had worked with the custodian before. The same practical way he used his shoulders, the same habit of glancing at the lantern when light mattered. I remember, Thomas. The custodian watched for a moment, measuring a new emotion in Thomas, loyalty bending toward duty. Suspicion had become indignation. Indignation shifted now into pleading. He did not raise his voice. He had learned that the custodian's steadiness pulled more than agitation ever had. Thomas, you know what the swing is. You know who lost it. Leave it here until a proper transfer. His sentence was a command shaped by memory. A remover braced his boot on the cart wheel. We have orders. We take items now or they'll be cleared later. The man spoke with a practical cadence that hid discomfort. The widow's mouth trembled. She pressed the swing into her chest as if the fiber could hold what hands could not. Rawls' ledger will show who voted. The custodian, I need to see it. The word need here was not personal hunger. It was a civic demand. Varco hesitated longer than she had earlier. An archivist stepped from under the portico of the closed town hall, dust on his cuffs and a sealed ledger under one arm. He wore spectacles on a thin cord and moved with the slow certainty of someone who sorted facts for a living. Archivist Rawls set the book on the portico step and folded his hands. The crowd tightened around them. Mr. Hale, Rawls, you may read the justification. It is recorded. He tilted the ledger so the custodian could see the seal. The custodian felt a small surge of relief. Facts could cut through suspicion if they were honest. They led him away from the square toward the portico and the registry room behind the hall, past boarded windows that had once let light into municipal rooms. As they walked, the custodian's steps kept time with the lantern in his satchel. He listened to the cart wheel bite and the remover's boots. In his head the night the memorial plaque had been lifted replayed. The scraping, the two figures hauling the plaque toward the cart, the way the child's swing had been taken without a word. He did not name these recollections memory as an abstraction but recited the actions. The plaque's brass scraped the cobble. The swing's rope had hissed. In the registry room under the town hall portico, Rawls broke the wax seal. He slid out a folded sheet and laid it on the desk. The paper smelled of old ink. The custodian leaned forward and read a line aloud, each name as if placing a stone on a map. Names of electors' signatures curled with the same practiced hand. The document did not claim neglect by accident. It described a deliberate civic decision. A covenant to allow certain districts to lapse where costs outweighed benefit and where communal will had decided to keep the landscape unchanged. The custodian's suspicion shifted again, this time into betrayal. He read a familiar signature and his hands tightened. He recognized the looping curl of a former keeper who had once walked these alleys, someone whose handwriting he had traced with his fingertip years ago while checking mortar seams. He had trusted that name. He felt light-headed, not from heat but from the shift in how he understood the plan. You signed this, Varco? He asked. The words were a pinprick. Varco did not flinch. It was voted, she said. Not one person acts alone. Her voice held the ledger's formality. The custodian's chest felt worked by something physical. He kept his shoulders forward, hands rigid at his sides. The archivist watched him curiously. Thomas's jaw worked. His face had folded inward with doubt. The widow remained at the registry room doorway, swing held to her hip like a child. She did not speak, but she had come this far. In her silence she changed the shape of the argument. Suddenly decisions had a human hand at the far end. Who else is named? The custodian. He spoke in short lines now, counting off questions. The ledger listed neighborhoods and votes and a clause that read, managed abandonment as civic remedy. The words had the clean smell of bureaucracy, but the consequences were articulated on the page in black ink. A clerk tapped the table. We held public notices. We allowed time for appeals. He pushed his spectacles up his nose and recited the administrative steps like proof against accusation. Time for appeals where? The custodian, where were the town meetings? Where was the offer to those who lived here? He cut the paper's comfort with direct demand. The councilwoman's face softened for a moment. She had expected resistance, but she had not expected the custodian's acute insistence. Thomas stepped forward. Hale, he said, voice low, I was told to fetch the swing. I can set it down and leave it if you say so. His voice carried the strain of someone pulled between orders and recognition. The custodian looked at Thomas and noticed trembling in his hands when he let go of the rope. Do it now, the custodian. He turned to the removers. Leave the widow's things. He did not ask permission. He used the serviceable authority that came from years of presence and quiet care. The removers exchanged a glance. The older one rubbed a thumb along his cheek where dust had ground into skin. Varco's reply came with a slow breath. You would overturn the vote. Her question was precise. The square outside would see a confrontation if things escalated. The custodian considered his options and felt the next emotion take him. Resolve. He would not move the city back into life, he told himself. His aim was to preserve the small acts that kept memory honest. But the ledger in his hand suggested a different plan, one chosen deliberately by people who had once belonged to this place. After a pause, an archivist pointed to a folded list under the ledger. He pulled a smaller sheet free and laid it on the desk. The custodian unfolded it with slow fingers, names, signatures, a compact set of initials. He scanned until a familiar name lay before him. A signature he had seen on housing repairs, on the permits that had let him keep a lean roof over the widow's coach house. The signature matched a friend he had visited last winter for tea. The discovery shifted his anger into a sharper, private hurt. You recognized it. Rawl quietly. You see how it reads. His voice did not judge. It only pointed. The custodian nodded once and folded the paper back. He had already felt the day tilt. He left the registry with the ledger under his arm, the younger keeper following at a measured distance. Outside, the square felt smaller, as if the posting that morning had closed not only the streets but the conversation. At noon the widow insisted on remaining at the doorway. She had not left. Instead she had seated herself on the threshold and drifted in small motions, smoothing the swing's rope with thumb and forefinger, turning the carved initials to sunlight, rehearsing a short remembered sentence aloud to herself. The custodian sat on the curb near her and did not attempt consolation beyond a steady presence. He had learned that steady presence could be a kind of reply. A scuffle began when the removers reached for a trunk that had a child's knitted cap folded inside. The widow rose and cried out. Words snapped between the removers and the gathered neighbors. The younger keeper stepped between the trunk and the widow's elbow. Thomas, stop. Leave that alone. His voice had a sharpness now. The removers hesitated, then asserted their orders. Lines of rapid dialogue followed. We are following orders, said one remover. Orders do not care for caps, came the reply. Thomas, the custodian. Do you understand why this matters? He watched Thomas's face for an answer. Thomas's eyes filled briefly and then narrowed into a decision. I do, Thomas. This was the midpoint where doubt hardened into action. The removers began to lift the trunk. A shove, a cry. The widow clutched the swing and nearly fell. The custodian grabbed the rope and planted his feet. He felt the wood rasp under his glove and found the body's memory of moving objects, how leverage shifts, how weight redistributes. He was steady. Someone knocked a crate over and a scattering of papers rained onto the cobbles. Among them the custodian noticed a folded covenant, creased with hands that had read and read commitments. He picked one sheet up and found not only signatures, but a clause he had not expected. A line that named the district for managed disappearance and invoked a pact signed across several decades of leaders. The discovery was a twist. The decision had not been quiet or sudden. It had been planned and acknowledged in writing, you see. Varco to the crowd, this is not the whim of a single day. It is a civic remedy, the way someone might say medicine to justify pain. The custodian felt a fresh shift, betrayal heated into a quieter, deeper grief. He thought of the nights he had tended doors and lit sills, of how he had traced mortar seams with his fingertip. Those were concrete acts he had done to hold this place together. The covenant wrote a new history over them. He could not let this stand without a final attempt to change its course. He Varco for time to speak with the council, for a recorded appeal. She looked toward the removers and then at Rawl. Thomas moved to the side of the widow and held out his hand to steady her. His touch was a small, human thing that meant more than any ledger. The custodian requested entry to the registry again, this time alone with the ledger. He walked under the portico and into the narrow registry room where the dust lay in quiet lines. He sat and opened the ledger to the page that laid out the rationale. The archivist had left the room and closed the door with an official click. Sunlight cut a bar across the desk where the page lay. He read the justification slowly and aloud in short sentences. letting the town's language ground him. The text argued that leaving specific districts untouched would preserve memory as landscape, reduce the strain on scarce materials, and relieve municipal liability. The custodian's hands curled around the ledger edge. He measured the distance between language and consequence. The words argued economy. The items on the remover's cart were the human price. Footsteps on the bridge called him. Thomas had come to fetch the custodian for a meeting on the stone bridge that overlooked the shattered rooftops. The bridge held a different light, wind eating at the hems of coats and carrying the smell of damp slate. Varco met them there with the removers in line behind her. The younger keeper stood slightly apart. This was the climax waiting in the outline, the point where the custodian would decide whether to keep or release the ledger. On the bridge the city lay like an open chest of buildings with collapsed roofs and exposed beams. The custodian balanced the ledger on a low wall and watched the councilwoman's face. He had the ledger in his hands now, and the name of a signer burned like a small coal in his memory. The younger keeper's hands shook. The removers had the cart lined up below with the widow's swing topmost. Varco spoke first. "Mr. Hale," she said, "the council intended this path. It is an act of civic management. We will not rebuild this zone." Her voice was the same measured instrument it had been in the square. "Councilwoman Varco," the custodian replied, taking a breath that did not look like a decision but was one. "You signed with men you trusted. You knew what it would mean." He did not ask her to justify herself. He put the ledger into the center of the bridge and set it open, showing the signatures. Thomas stepped forward. "I cannot move the widow's swing while she is here," he said. He was no longer a boy of duty alone. His voice held the tremor of someone who had seen the thing the swing did for a child and now recognized the cost of taking it away. The removers braced. One of them placed a hand on the ledger as if to take it. The custodian watched the man's fingers hover. The man had an expression like someone who had to do this work to feed children at home. This was a human calculation, duty against need. The custodian felt a surge of clarity. Choices made by councilmen had consequences measured in nightly routines and the sight of a child's rope. He had to act in a way that matched his role. He closed the ledger, wrapped it in cloth from his satchel, and then, without fanfare, moved toward the bridge rail. For a long moment he held the ledger over the dark water that ran under the bridge. He could have let it slide from his hands. He could have destroyed the evidence of the covenant. The choice would change what people knew and how the city would remember the decision. The younger keeper, voice nearly a whisper, "Mr. Hale, what will you do?" He the name to anchor himself. The custodian did not answer with words. He set the ledger on the stone, turned to Varco and said, "If you force removal now, you will have made them take what matters and left the rest to crumble. I will not let you take those small things without record." He reached into his satchel, produced a narrow folio and a stub of pencil. He wrote one careful line. A ledger entry that recorded who had taken what, naming the widow's swing, the plaque, the trunk, and the signatures that authorized the action. Varco watched him write. "You cannot alter the council's records," she said. "I will not alter them." He replied, "I will add this. A record that certain items were taken under protest, that the names of those who remained are noted." His actions were a refusal to let forgetting happen without at least a local, stubborn truth. The removers tightened their grip on the cart. The widow watched the pencil move, and then began to cry softly. Thomas took the swing from his shoulder and set it on the stone steps beside the custodian. He did not hand it to the widow. He placed it where it could be reached. The action was small but decisive. The custodian made a final entry and folded the folio into the ledger's cloth. He took the brass key from his neck, clicked it open on the ledger's lock, and then closed the ledger again. He did not rip it or cast it into the water. He had chosen a middle path, to preserve a private record while allowing the public covenant to stand. That decision rippled through the square. Orders shifted. Varco gave a curt nod and the removers lowered the cart handles. One remover met Thomas at the eye and after a long pause, stepped back. The widow moved forward, pressed her forehead against the swing, and then set herself down so that the rope lay over her knees. The custodian lit the small oil lantern and held it in one hand. The light pooled in a soft circle on the stone. In the days that followed, the custodian performed a ritual of maintenance. He lit that lantern on a sill every evening, placed a sprig of grass he found at dawn into a crack in the pavement near the swing, and wrote one clean ledger entry each night recording a single observation. Who had visited, what item had been set aside, who had left a note. He tended the small acts of care as though each one were a stitch in a fabric no law could quite unwave. Thomas brought bread for the widow on several mornings and stayed to listen while she recited the child's small stories. Varco returned to the registry only twice more, each time leaving a stamped form and avoiding the square. The removers completed some tasks but left others, choosing which things to take and which to leave on the custodian's quiet insistence. The archivist Rawle made a public note that additional petitions were received, though he did not alter the council's covenant. The city did not come back in the way some might have wanted. Roofs remained sagging, windows stayed boarded. But in corners and doorways the custodian's lanterns glowed each night. People who had lingered moved in small ways. A chair placed on a stoop, a pot of wild thyme planted in a cracked gutter, the placement of a knitted cap on a nail where wind would not take it. These were not reconstructions, they were deliberate acts of keeping something gentle and human in a place the council had chosen to let go. The final twist came when the custodian found, folded into the ledger one evening, a note from the signer he had recognized earlier. The note was not an apology. It was a short factual sentence. The signer had accepted the vote and had chosen to sign for fear of worse outcomes elsewhere. The line changed how the custodian saw the decision. It was not simple malice. It was calculation mixed with compulsion. He read the line, then closed the ledger and laid it near the widow's swing. He touched the carved initials with the pad of his thumb. Then he wrote one more entry, the names of those who had stood in the square that day and the single act they had allowed to remain. He set the ledger into his satchel and locked it with the brass key. On a morning when the fog still held the cobbles damp, the custodian climbed the narrow stair to the roof of his old rounds. He placed the lantern on the sill and watched a younger figure, Thomas, walk across the square carrying a small stool. The widow sat on the threshold and set the swing to move once, slowly back and forth. The motion was not grand, but it was an assertion of ongoing life. The custodian traced the mortar seam of the wall with a fingertip and then, with deliberate care, pressed the brass key into his palm. He had resisted both the council's erasure and the urge to force the city back to life. He had written facts into a private ledger and left small acts of care as markers. The ledger would not stop the council's plan, but it would show that someone had chosen to note what was taken and who had remained. As dusk settled, he placed the satchel on the step beside the swing and stood. Thomas approached and nodded once. The widow smiled, not a recovery but a softened acceptance. The removers had gone. Varco's carriage moved away down the lane. The custodian lifted the lantern, sheltering the flame with gloved hands, and walked toward the bridge where the ledger had lain. He set the lantern on the bridge rail, closed his palm once around the brass key, and then moved to lock the registry room door from the inside. He turned the key, the metal clicking a small, final sound. That click was not triumph and not surrender. It was a recorded choice anchored in an action. He left the ledger within the town hall's registry, folded into the pages where signatures had first appeared, and he placed the folio he had written into the satchel in his chest. The last image of the day was small, the lamp's light shrinking behind the drawn blinds as he descended the stair. He did not shout a verdict. He did not call the town. He kept the ledger and tended the swing and wrote in his private folio. The city would sleep slowly, some things taken, some things left to rust. The custodian had made one definitive motion. To keep a record, to name those who acted and those who remained. He walked back into the square, lantern raised, and set it on the widow's stoop. The widow reached up and touched the lantern glass as if testing it. The final line of the chapter is a concrete image. The custodian closes the registry door behind him and turns the key a second time, the sound of metal meeting metal echoing once across the empty square.